Erwin Rommel was the most famous German general of the war, possibly the most famous general on any side. The British feared him. The Americans studied him. Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal after the fall of Tobruk. Winston Churchill stood in the House of Commons and told Parliament there was no shame in being beaten by such an opponent. Desert Fox was untouchable until he wasn't. By the summer of 1944, Rommel was in Normandy commanding Army Group B. He had already told Hitler privately that the war was lost. On July 17th, a British aircraft strafed his staff car on a country road. His skull was fractured. He was thrown from the vehicle. He survived, barely, and went home to recover. 3 days later, the July 20th bomb plot against Hitler failed. Arrests began. Names were pulled from people under torture. Rommel's name came up. The evidence was thin. He was not a central planner, had no role in placing the bomb. In the atmosphere of hysteria that followed the failed assassination, suspicion was enough to condemn a man. On the morning of October 14th, 1944, Rommel walked in his garden with his 15-year-old son. He counted 5 trucks of armed men in civilian clothes parked along the road outside his house. He told his son quietly that 2 generals from Berlin were coming to see him at noon, and 2 generals did come. Their names were Bergdorf and Maisel. They told Rommel he had been implicated in treason and offered him 3 choices: go to Berlin and face Hitler, stand trial before the People's Court, take his own life. If he chose the third option, his family would be protected, his pension paid, he would receive a state funeral as a national hero. Rommel went upstairs, told his wife and son what had been decided. He said to his son, "In a quarter of an hour, I will die." He put on his Afrika Korps jacket. He picked up his field marshal's baton, got into the back of the general's car, and was driven into a quiet stretch of forest road. 2 generals stepped out. Rommel was left alone with a cyanide capsule. 20 minutes later, Manfred Rommel received a phone call informing him that his father was dead. Hitler ordered a day of national mourning. German people were told that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had succumbed to his wounds from the Normandy air attack. He was given a state funeral, lie held until after the war ended. Wilhelm Keitel was a different kind of officer entirely. As Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces High Command, he sat beside Hitler for the entire war and signed whatever was put in front of him. He signed the commando order directing German forces to execute Allied Special Operations soldiers on sight, even if they were uniformed and had surrendered. He drafted the Night and Fog Decree, which authorized the secret arrest and disappearance of resistance members across occupied Europe. He authorized the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war that resulted in millions of deaths from starvation, disease, and exposure. His 2 sons were killed on the Eastern Front fighting a war he had helped design. At Nuremberg, Keitel's defense was that he had been following orders. He was a soldier. He had no choice. A prison psychiatrist who interviewed him described him as having no more backbone than a jellyfish. The tribunal found him guilty on all 4 counts. The sentence was death. In the early hours of October 16th, 1946, Keitel was led into a gymnasium converted into an execution chamber. The trapdoor was poorly built, too small for the men who would fall through it. When Keitel dropped, he struck his head on the sides of the opening. He was pronounced dead. His body was cremated. His ashes were scattered in a river so that no grave could ever become a shrine. Alfred Jodl was Keitel's operational counterpart, a man who translated Hitler's strategic decisions into executable military orders. He spent most of the war at Hitler's side in the Wolf's Lair. He signed the Commissar Order, which directed German forces to shoot Soviet political officers upon capture. He authorized campaigns against civilian populations across occupied Europe. And then, on May 7th, 1945, was Jodl who sat down at a table in Reims, France, and signed the German Instrument of Surrender, the document that ended the war in Europe. He was arrested immediately afterward. At Nuremberg, he pleaded not guilty before God, before history, and before his people. The tribunal was not moved. He was found guilty on all 4 counts. On October 16th, 1946, the same morning as Keitel, Jodl walked to the scaffold. His last words were, "Greetings to you, my eternal Germany." He was hanged. His ashes were scattered in the same river as Keitel's. Hermann Göring was the highest-ranking Nazi to appear at Nuremberg, and he walked into that courtroom intending to dominate it. Commander of the Luftwaffe, President of the Reichstag, Hitler's designated successor at the outbreak of war, he had been the second most powerful man in Germany for most of a decade. He arrived bloated addicted to painkillers, seemingly broken. Within weeks, he had kicked the addiction, shed the weight, and transformed himself into the most formidable personality in the courtroom. He sparred with prosecutors. He lectured the judges, was funny and sharp and completely unrepentant. The tribunal found him guilty on all 4 counts and sentenced him to death. Objected not to the sentence, but to the method. He was a soldier, he said, and hanging was a dishonor. He requested a firing squad. The request was denied. The night before his scheduled execution, October 15th, 1946, guards found him dead in his cell. He'd bitten down on a glass capsule of potassium cyanide. How it reached him has never been conclusively established. He left behind a letter explaining his reasoning and timed his death to the hour. His body was carried into the execution chamber on a stretcher anyway, and the blanket was pulled back so that reporters could confirm he was dead. Even in death, Goering managed to steal the last scene. Walter Model was Hitler's fireman, the general sent wherever the front was collapsing. Whenever an army group was on the verge of disintegration, Hitler sent Model. Stabilized the Eastern Front after Operation Bagration tore it apart. Halted the Allied advance in the West after the Normandy breakout. He was ruthless, demanding, seemingly inexhaustible. One of the very few commanders Hitler trusted unconditionally through the war's final years. By April 1945, there was nothing left to save. Model's Army Group B was surrounded by American forces, the Ruhr Pocket. April 17th, 325,000 German soldiers surrendered to the Americans, one of the largest single surrenders on the Western Front. Model dissolved his command rather than formally capitulate, releasing his remaining men to surrender individually. He had already told his staff what he intended. He said, "What remains for a commander after a defeat?" In ancient times, he took poison. He had also learned that Soviet authorities wanted him for war crimes committed on the Eastern Front. On April 21st, 1945, Walter Model walked alone into the forest near Duisburg and shot himself. He was 54 years old. His body was buried in a field grave. 10 years later, in 1955, his remains were exhumed and reinterred in a military cemetery in Germany. Günther von Kluge was known among his fellow officers as Clever Hans, a nickname that was partly admiring and partly a pun, since Klug means clever in German. He had commanded armies across Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. By the summer of 1944, Hitler sent him to the Western Front to replace Gerd von Rundstedt, who had famously told Keitel that the only sensible thing left to do was make peace. Klug's position was impossible from the start. He knew the war was lost. He had known men in the resistance. He had even accepted a large personal financial gift from Hitler, check drawn from the German treasury, which some historians believe was used as leverage to keep senior commanders loyal. When the July 20th plot failed and the arrests began, Klug's name appeared on lists of suspected conspirators. Forces in Normandy were being destroyed. Suspicion was closing around him from every direction. On August 17th, Hitler dismissed him and ordered him back to Berlin. Klug understood what that meant. He had watched what happened to the others. Before he died, Klug wrote Hitler a letter. He urged him to end the war and show the greatness needed to bring a hopeless struggle to a close. He described Germany's certain defeat and asked the Führer to think of the German people. Then he took poison. Died on August 19th, 1944, 61 years old. Hitler read the letter, handed it to Jodl, and remarked that Klug would have been arrested regardless. Friedrich Paulus led 265,000 men into Stalingrad in the summer of 1942, watched as Soviet forces encircled them completely in November. The relief effort failed. The air bridge failed. By January, the men inside the city were freezing, starving, and dying in their thousands. January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal by radio. It was widely understood as a message. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered to an enemy. The promotion was an expectation, delivered without a word. Following day, Paulus surrendered to Soviet forces in the basement of a ruined department store. The 91,000 soldiers taken captive half died on the march to Siberian prison camps. Those who reached the camps, the vast majority never came home. 6,000 eventually returned to Germany. Paulus had already told a fellow general exactly what he thought of Hitler's expectation. He said, "I have no intention of shooting myself for this bohemian corporal." In Soviet captivity after the July 20th plot, Paulus became a vocal critic of the Nazi regime. He joined the Soviet-sponsored National Committee for a Free Germany, broadcasting appeals for German soldiers to surrender. He testified for the prosecution at Nuremberg. He was released in 1953 and settled in East Germany, where he worked as a military history researcher. In late 1956, he was diagnosed with motor neuron disease and became progressively weaker. Died in Dresden on February 1st, 1957, exactly 14 years and 1 day after his surrender at Stalingrad. In his will, he asked to be buried beside his wife in Baden-Baden. She had died in 1949, never having seen him again after he left for the Eastern Front in 1942. Erich von Manstein was, by the judgment of many military historians, the most gifted operational commander Germany produced in the entire war. He designed the plan that defeated France in 6 weeks. He commanded on the Eastern Front with devastating effectiveness. He came closer than anyone to relieving the encircled 6th Army at Stalingrad, argued with Hitler constantly, insisting on flexible defense, strategic withdrawals, preserving forces for decisive counterattacks, until Hitler had enough. In March 1944, he was dismissed and never received another command. British forces captured him in August 1945. In 1949, a Hamburg court convicted him on 9 of 17 war crimes charges. He served less than 4 years before being released on medical grounds. His memoirs, which became one of the most widely read military books of the post-war era. In 1956, he became an advisor to the new West German Bundeswehr, helping build the military that would defend his country alongside the very nations that had defeated him. He lived quietly in Bavaria for the rest of his life. Erich von Manstein died on June 10, 1973, of a stroke. He was 85 years old, outlived the Reich he served by nearly 3 decades. 8 men, fates. 1 forced to die by his own government in a forest. 2 hanged by the Allies, 1 who cheated the gallows with a hidden capsule. 1 who walked into the woods and shot himself rather than be captured. 1 who swallowed poison rather than face Berlin. 1 who surrendered, survived Soviet captivity for a decade, died of disease in a divided Germany. 1 who lived long enough to become a military advisor to the country that once defeated him. The Third Reich promised its generals glory. What it actually delivered, for most of them, was destruction. Not always at the hands of the enemy, often at the hands of the state they had served.